Sorry about that. Now I'm here. Welcome to Fireside Fairytales. If you haven't tuned in before, this is where we basically talk about fairy tales. And we'll just basically read a story and we discuss it a bit if we wish. But basically, it's just that. Yeah, it's just us telling stories. It's a part of Varietal. Varietal literature. It's a group of writers from Vancouver. This isn't the only thing we do. So if you're interested in writing or stories, you check out in the description, there's our website, or you can check out the YouTube channel and you will find more information about us. But tonight we're doing Cornish fairy tales and folk tales, specifically from a book called North Cornwall Fairies and Legends, which comes from the turn of the century. Although I guess I gotta clarify now, that was the 19th century to the 20th century, not the most recent turn of the century. This is a collection put together by Ennis Tregarthen, which is the fake name, if you will, of a person named Nellie Sloggett. Nellie Sloggett did write some of her own stories, but became very interested in Cornish-specific folk tales and legends. Now, if you don't know much about Cornwall or any Cornish cultural group, that's fine. You know, it's a fairly unique and small group. They are on the southwest corner of England, Cornwall, and it's a little kick of land that is just surrounded by beaches. And you might be surprised to learn that the thing that Cornwall's really known for is surfing. We're going to be looking at folktales from it, and you might think, okay, well, that's a really specific corner of England. Why do they have their own folktales? To be honest, I don't fully understand why, but they do definitely have their own myths and legends there. But it is actually interesting thing I learned was that Cornwall and the Cornish people are a distinct cultural Celtic group, part of the Celtic family of languages and such that still exist, which puts them in at least sort of cousin territory of Ireland and Scotland, but the Gaelic part of Scotland. I think Wales and Manx is also a part of that group. So they are a small but formidable and very old group of people that have their own tales on this little kick of land just surrounded by beaches and roped together with castles and old mines and so on. And they as a result make very unique tales. So what are we talking about tonight? Well, this book in particular, again called North Cornwall Fairies and Legends, is interested in a thing called a Piskey. A Piskey is similar, I suppose, to the Irish, elves and English gnomes and things like that. They're little people. They have their own distinct character and nature in as they seem to in all the different Celtic groups that have little people in their stories. So we're going to look at an actually rather lengthy tale. So we're only looking at one tonight, but we may even still go long, called The Adventures of a Piskey in Search of His Laugh. So that's my preamble. Again, if you have questions as we go, just drop them in the chat, and I'll be happy to talk to you about them. So this is The Adventures of a Piskey in Search of His Laugh. The moon was shining softly down on the grey ruins of King Arthur's castle by the Tintagel Sea, and on hundreds of little piskies dancing in a great Piskey ring on the mainland known as the Castle Gardens. Right, let me add, it certainly helps if you have a background in King Arthur's myths, but I don't think it's absolutely necessary. The story does rope in a lot of that, though. GS says, never heard of a Piskey. Well, that's perfect then, because we're going to hear a story that gives us a sense of their personality. I will say they're more cheerful than most of the little people we've read about so far. In the center of the ring stood a little fiddler, fiddling away with all his might, keeping time with his head and one tiny foot. The faster he played and flung out the merry tune, and on the quiet, moonlit night, the faster the Piskeys danced. As they danced, they almost burst their sides with laughter, and their laughter and the music of the little fiddler was distinctly heard by an old man and his wife, who then lived in the cottage near the castle. One little Piskey, somewhat taller than a clothes peg, was the best dancer there, and his laugh was the merriest. He was dancing with a Piskey about his own size, who could hardly keep step with his twinkling feet. As the Piskeys careered around and around the Piskey ring, the tiny chap who was the best dancer and had the merriest laugh suddenly stopped laughing, and his little dancing feet gave out under him, and down he went with a crash, dragging his little companion with him. Before they could pick themselves up, the Piskeys who were coming on behind, not seeing the two sprawling on the ring, fell on them, and in another moment little fiddler Piskey saw a moving heap of green-coated little bodies and a brown tangle of tiny hands and feet. So amazed was he at such an unusual sight that he stopped fiddling and let his fiddle slip out of his hand and unnoticed on the grass. When the little men had picked themselves up, except the one who had caused the mishap, they began to pitch into him for tumbling and causing them to tumble, and something in his tiny face made them stop. "What made you go down on your stum jacket like that, when you were dancing so beautifully?" asked a Piskey, not unkindly. "I don't know," he answered, looking up at his little brother Piskey with a strange expression in his face, which was pinched and drawn and pale as one of their own Piskey stools. And instead of a laugh in his dark little eyes, there was misery and woe. The strange expression in his eyes quite frightened the Piskeys, and one said, "Well, what is the matter with you? You're looking worse than a cat in a fit." "Am I?" said the poor little Piskey. "I'm feeling very queer. It was a queerness that made me fall on my little stum jacket. Am I ill like those great men and woman creatures we sometimes entice into the bog with Piskey lights?" "Well, I've never heard of a Piskey getting ill or sick," said a little brown Piskey. "Have we?" turning to speak to the little fiddler, who'd come over to his companions, bringing his fiddle with him. "I most certainly haven't," answered the little fiddler. "Then what is the matter with me if I'm not sick?" asked the little Piskey, who was looking so queer. "Perhaps Grandfer Pinsky would be able to tell you, for I can't," said the tiny fiddler. "Where is Grandfer Piskey?" asked the poor little sufferer. "I am afraid I am getting worse, for all the dance has left my legs." "Grandfer Piskey is over on the island," cried a little Piskey. "I wonder if we call them pixies," Gia says. "I imagine they have a similar root." So he is. The thing is, though, pixies usually fly. These don't fly. They don't have wings. "So he is," said all the other Piskeys, sending their glance in that direction where, on the edge of a beetling cliff facing Castle Gardens, stood a tiny old man with a white beard flowing down to his bare little feet. He was dressed up, as were all the other Piskeys, in a bright green coat and a red stocking cap. He disappeared into a Piskey hole, and the Piskeys had dug in the cliff, which led down into an underground passage between the island and the mainland, and very soon he reappeared from another hole in Castle Gardens, a few feet from where the Piskeys were anxiously awaiting him. "Why are you not fiddling, dancing, and laughing?" asked little Whitebeard, winking his eyes on the silent little Piskey crowd, standing near their little brother Piskey, who was looking so queer. You are wasting precious time standing here doing nothing. Before a great while the moon will have set over us, Travos, and the time for merrymaking and hijinks will be over, he added, as not a Piskey spoke. We are not fiddling, dancing, and laughing because of something that has befallen our little brother, said the tiny fiddler at last, pointing to the poor little Piskey, who had raised himself to a sitting position and was seated on the Piskey ring. He is a rum-looking little customer, sure enough, said the old Whitebeard, glancing in the direction of the place where the little fiddler pointed. What is the matter with him? That is what we want to know, answered the little fiddler. Come and have a closer look at him. Grandfer Piskey. And Grandfer Piskey came. What is the matter with him? Asked one of the Piskeys, when the Whitebeard had stared down a minute or more on the little atom of misery sitting humped up on the edge of the great green ring like a toad on a hot shovel. You are so old and wise, you'll be able to tell us what ails him, if anybody can. He thinks he is sick like the big people. We lead a fine dance round the fields and commons sometimes. As Grandfer Piskey stood stock still before the little afflicted Piskey, winking and blinking and solemnly shaking his head. He is not sick like those people of whom you spoke, said the Whitebeard at last. He has the makeouts, shrilled a little voice with a laugh somewhere in the background. No, he hasn't the makeouts, you impudent little rascal, said Grandfer Piskey, without lifting his gaze from the poor little fellow on the edge of the ring. That's a complaint from which you apparently suffer. What was he? What has he? Asked the tiny fiddler, impatiently scraping his fiddlestick over his fiddle, as if to emphasize his words. It isn't what he has, but what he hasn't, said the old Whitebeard in the same solemn voice. I was going to say that our poor little brother has lost his laugh. Lost his laugh? Cried little Fiddler Piskey, and all the other little Piskeys, and their tiny faces of consternation showed what a terrible thing had befallen their poor little brother. Yes, he has had the sad misfortune to lose his laugh, said the old Whitebeard, winking and blinking harder than ever as he stood before the unhappy little Piskey who had lost his laugh. And worse still, he is quite done for till he finds it again. Where is my laugh gone to, Grandfer Piskey? Asked the miserable little Piskey who had met with that dreadful misfortune. I don't know more than the little man in the moon, answered the tiny old Whitebeard. But if I were you, I would go look for it. Where must I go and look for my laugh? Asked the poor little Piskey. I have not the smallest idea, but I should go and search for it till I found it. Will you come with me and search for my laugh? Asked the little Piskey with a look of anxiety in his wee dark eyes as Grandfer Piskey was moving away. I'm afraid I can't. It is my duty to stop with your brothers to see that they don't grow silly and lose their laugh. Besides, it is not quite the thing for an old Whitebeard like me to go traveling about the country with a youngster like you in search of a laugh. Will you go with me to look for my laugh? Asked the little Piskey, fixing his gaze on the tiny fiddler. I would go with you gladly if I were not Fiddler Piskey, he answered, touching his fiddler lightly with his bow. But if I were to go gallivanting up and down the country in search of your laugh, there would be nobody to play the dancing tune for when our brothers dance in the moonshine. And this is a picture from Cornwall. There are some in this book, and I think they're neat. I don't know a better way to put it. Won't one of you go with me and help me find my laugh? Begged the miserable little fellow, glancing from one Piskey to another as they crowded around him. Oh, we would if we hadn't so much dancing to do, they said. We have to dance in every Piskey ring from Tintagel Head to Crackington Hawn up to St. Genny's before the moon grows as small as a wren's claw. Must I go by myself in search of my laugh? Said the poor little Piskey in a heartbreaking voice. Yes, you must go by yourself to look for your laughs, answered all the little Piskeys. You should not have been so foolish as to lose it. And the selfish little brown men, Grandfer Piskey, Fiddler Piskey, and all the other Piskeys turned their backs on their unfortunate little brother and ran away across the gardens over the cliffs towards Bossiny, halfway between which was another big Piskey ring, and by the poor little Piskey who had lost his laugh heard in the distance as he sat all alone in the great grassy place their merry laughter and the music of Fiddler Piskey's tiny fiddle. He was a very sad little Piskey as he listened to the merriment of his little brother Piskeys, and the moon sailing along the dark velvety blue of the midnight sky above the ruins of King Arthur's castle and gardens, which was the picture we just saw. Never looked down on such a woe-begone little Piskey before. He had always been happy and gay until now, and having no laugh was such a strange experience that it was no wonder he felt as miserable and wished as he did. Wished it for whatever reason means sad, the footnotes tell me. I have no idea where that comes from. I'm assuming it's a Cornish word. As he sat there all along on the ring in his own little dancing feet had helped to make, two tiny hands were suddenly thrust up out of a small earth heap half a foot from where he was sitting. So dainty were the hands that he thought they belonged to one of the little good people, a distant relation of his, and thinking that somehow one had gotten buried under the earth, he got up and from the ring to help her out, and without waiting to say, "Allow me," or anything so polite, he caught hold of the wee hands, and pulling with all his strength, he dragged something very dark and soft out of the earth heap, and saw to his surprise and disgust that it was the round, plump body of a mole. "Whatever did you drag me out of the Warthill for, you horrid creature, whoever you are?" cried the mole, who was not as soft as she looked. "It took me hours to throw up that beautiful hill, and now it has fallen down into my tunnel, and my work will have all been to be done over again thanks to you." "I'm so sorry," said the Piskey. "I saw two dinky little hands sticking up, and I thought a relation of mine had got buried. When I did my best to get her out, I found it was only a want, as the country people call you moles." "A want, indeed!" exclaimed the mole. "Who are you, pray, to speak so disdainfully? If I am only a want, I was not always the poor thing I am now. Once upon a time I was a very great lady because I was foolish and proud and very vain of my beauty. I was turned into a mole. My little hands are the only thing left of me to show who I once was." "I'm very sorry for you," said the Piskey, with a strong note of sympathy in his voice, so entirely new to him that he scarcely knew it was himself speaking. For Piskeys, though they are merry and gay, are often selfish in the extreme. "I am more sorry for you than I can say," he went on. "It cannot be nice to be only a want. When once you were a beautiful lady." "I am a Piskey," said the little dark mole, as it was silent. "A Piskey, are you?" she cried, speaking at last. I remember you little Piskey people quite well. I have cause to remember. Once, when I was a grand lady and wore fine clothes, you Piskies led me into a bog and spoilt my silken gown. I did not bless you then, and I do not bless you now. You are still up to your tricks, I find to my cost, for you have done your best to pull down my house about my ears. I did not mean to do anything so unkind, said the little Piskey. I'm not merry enough now to play games on anyone. How is that? Asked the mole. I've lost my laugh. My heart is as heavy as lead, he answered sorrowfully. Lost your laugh? Well, that is very strange, cried the mole. Yes, it is, and I am quite done for. So Grandfer Piskey told my little brothers till I find it again. Why don't you go and look for your laugh instead of throwing down want hills? Said the mole severely. It would be more to your credit if you did. I suppose it would, replied the Piskey, but unfortunately I don't know where to go to look for my laugh. Have you seen it? No, I haven't, snapped the mole. I can't see without eyes. I've lost my eyesight through working underground for so many long centuries. Do you know anybody who has seen my laugh? asked the little Piskey, and who would kindly tell me where to go and find it? I'm afraid I don't, answered the mole, except the little man in the lantern. He's the most likely person I know of to have seen your laugh. He's always flipping about the country in the night time in his little lantern. He sees most things that wander by at night. He's a kind-hearted little fellow, and if he has seen your laugh, he'll be sure to help you find it. You know, of course, where the little lantern man is to be found? I've seen his lantern in the marshes sometimes, answered the Piskey. I saw it rush by a few weeks ago when I and my brothers were lying snug and warm in a great Piskey bed at Rough Tor Marsh. But as I do not happen to know the lantern man, will you please come with me to Rough Tor Marsh and ask him if he has seen my laugh? What next will you ask me to do? Cried the mole. No, I cannot go with you. I am far too busy to go tramping around the country with a little brown Piskey like you in search of a laugh. I have a tunnel to make across Castle Gardens that my dear little baby wants to run about in, and I must do it before the sun shines over the tors. If you really want to find your laugh, you must go and ask the lantern man yourself. The sooner you go, the better, or you may lose the chance of asking him if he's seen it. I dare say you are right, said the little Piskey with a heavy sigh. But I don't like the idea of traveling all the way here to Rough Tor Marsh. My feet are heavy like my heart, and now I've lost my laugh. Yet I suppose I must go, for I am a wished poor thing without it. And you would say so too, Mrs. Mole, if your eyesight wasn't so bad. Mrs. Mole, indeed, snapped the velvet-coated little creature, raising her tiny hands in anger at such an insult. I beg you to tell you that I am not Mrs. Mole, but the Lady Want, and that, although I have fallen from my high estate, I am still a lady of high degree, as my tiny hands bear witness. And she held them out for him to see. I'm not up to in fine distinctions, said the little Piskey in a humble voice, and I beg your ladyship's pardon. The Piskey's sad little voice so appeased the Lady Want that she fully forgave his ignorance, and told him he was quite nice-mannered for a Piskey, and hoped the little lantern man had seen his laugh, and would be able to tell him where to find it. And then her little ladyship disappeared into the molehill, her tiny lady hands and all. And there there is another picture of Cornwall, specifically. That is Tintagel Castle, somewhere in there. Pardon me. When she had gone, the little Piskey turned his face towards the east, where the tors rose up dark and shadowy against the moonlit sky. Then he looked back at the great keep and turned his glance on the castle gardens, wherein the long ago courtly knights and great ladies walked among the flowers that blossomed there under the shadow of the loopholed walls, and listened, as they walked, to the music of the Tintagel Sea and the great waves that sometimes broke against the dark cliffs of the headland on which the grim old castle stood, where good King Arthur was born. The little Piskey was saying goodbye to that delightful spot with its soft turf and its beautiful Piskey ring on which he danced times without number, for the poor lonely little fellow did not know if he should ever come back. Then he broke off a bit of a knapweed stem for a staff to help him on his journey to Rough Tor Marsh. Before the moon had laid down a lane of silver fire on the rippling waters between Tintagel Head and Travose, the little Piskey had set out on his travels in search of his laugh. Piskies always travel by night, and after many nights of wandering, the little Piskey who had lost his laugh came to the bog country, where he had last seen the little lantern. Very tired and footsore was that poor little Piskey after his long journey, for having lost his laugh, he had no dance in his feet to help him along, and he felt so done up as he sat by the great bog, or Piskey bed as he called it, that he did not care whether he found his laugh or not. But when he had rested a while, he felt better and looked over the great marshy place with eager eyes, to see if the little lantern man was anywhere about. To his delight he was, for far away in the distance he saw a white gleam of his lantern. He kept his eyes upon the light, and by, when the lanterns came rocking over the bog in his direction, he stood up on the edge of the water, ready to call. It disappeared ever so many times among the bog myrtles and willows, but every time it reappeared it was closer, and when it came near enough for him to see the little lantern man inside, he shouted, "Little man in the lantern, please stop. I want to ask you something." But whether the little lantern man heard or not, he did not stop, and he and his lantern flipped by the disappointed little Piskey as quickly as a witty mouse on the wing, and was lost to the sight in the reeds and rushes on the other side of the great marsh. After a while, the little lantern man came back to the place where the Piskey was still standing, and the light from the lantern was brighter and softer than a hedge full of glowworm lights shining all at once. As the lantern was passing the little Piskey, he called out louder than before, "Little man in the lantern, please stop. I want to ask you something." But little lantern man did not stop, and he and his lantern rushed by as quickly as before, and the poor little Piskey followed the rocking lantern with his eyes over the great marsh. Just as he was in despair of the wonderful little lantern coming his way again, it came, and so fast did it come, and so afraid was he of its passing him without making himself heard, that he shouted with all his might, "Please, little lantern man, stop! I want to ask you something." And to his joy, the little lantern man stopped. The door of the little lantern opened wide, and a tiny shining face looked out. "Did anybody call?" asked the little lantern man in a voice so kind that Piskey's little heart leaped for joy. "Yes, I called," said the little Piskey. "I called twice before, but you did not stop." "I never heard you call till now," said the little lantern man. "Who are you? What do you want?" "I am an unfortunate little Piskey who has lost his laugh," answered the Piskey. "And I have tramped all the way here from Tintagel Head to Rough Tor Marsh to ask if you've seen it." "Lost your laugh? You poor little chap. ejaculated the little lantern man in the same kind voice. "How came you to lose it?" The little Piskey told him how he had lost his laugh, and what Grandfer Piskey had said to him, and how the mole who called herself the Lady Want had told him to come to him. "I would gladly help you find your laugh if I knew where it was," said the lantern man when the Piskey had told him all. "But unfortunately I have never seen it." "Haven't you?" cried the poor little Piskey. "I am disappointed. As you were always traveling about the country in your little lantern, I felt sure you had seen my laugh." "I only travel in marshy ground," said the little lantern man, standing in the doorway of his tiny lantern, "and your laugh may not have passed along my way." "Do you happen to know anybody else who has seen my laugh?" asked the little Piskey anxiously. "Nobody except Giant Tregeagle, of whom I dare say you have heard, that unhappy fellow for whom for some terrible wrongdoing has to dip Dawsmere Pool dry with a limpet shell." "Yes, I've heard about that great giant from Grandfer Piskey," answered the little Piskey. "He was a wicked seigneur who once had a fine house at Dawsmere Pool and a great park at Bodmin Moors, and he is often flying about the country with the wicked one at his heels." "The very same," cried the little lantern man. "He travels from east to west and from west to south and back again. He was sure to have seen your laugh." "I'm afraid my laugh is too small for a great big giant to have noticed, even if it passed him," said the little Piskey. "He isn't so big. What he can see a laugh," said the lantern man. "You'd better go ask him." "I don't know where he is," said the little Piskey, who was in a most dejected frame of mind. "He's at Dawsmere Pool, or was not long since, doing his best to dip the big pool dry." "I'm rather tired after tramping here from Tintagel," said the little fellow, "and I don't feel like going all the way to Dawsmere Pool. I have no spring in my legs since my laugh left me," he added, as the little lantern man smiled rather sadly. "I never knew what it was to be tired and wished before I lost my laugh." "I don't suppose you did, you poor little chap," cried the little lantern man, "and you must do all you can to find your laugh. I'm going to Dawsmere Pool, or the Magic Lake as it was called long ago, and if you don't mind traveling in my lantern, I'll give you a lift as far as that." "Will you?" exclaimed the little Piskey, his tiny brown face brightening as the lantern man smiled. "You are very kind. I will go with you gladly." "That's right," cried the little lantern man. He held out his hand, which shone like his face, and helped the little brown Piskey into his lantern. When the Piskey was safe inside the lantern, he thought it was the very brightest place he's ever been in. "Even brighter than a fairy's palace," he said. "There's no seat in my lantern except the floor," said the little lantern man, as the Piskey looked about him. "The floor is not uncomfortable if you care to sit down. I always sleep on it when my night work of giving light to the poor things that live in the marshes is done." "I'd rather stand, thank you," returned the Piskey. "I can look out of your windows better." "Do as you like. Only it is my duty to tell you that you'd be safer on the floor. My lantern and I travel so fast that the creatures that fly by night often knock up against us and turn us upside down." And that picture is Rough Tor's granite piled high in the bright little lantern. I can't read the rest of that. It's in blue text for no reason, but this is around Rough Tor Marsh. The little lantern man shut the door of his lantern as he was speaking, and in another minute They were rushing over Rough Tor Marsh at a fearful speed, and the little Piskey had to hold onto the frame of one of the tiny windows to keep himself on his feet. By Rough Tor's granite-piled heights, the bright little lantern went by. On by Brown Willie, it sped, and by many a solitary hill, almost as wild and untamed as old Rough Tor itself. Over lonely moors, bogs, rivers, and streams, it flew and rocked and whirled as it went. As it sped on, it bumped against all manner of strange creature, and once a night hawk turned the little lantern upside down, and the Piskey found himself standing on his head, with his tiny lean legs sticking up in the air, and he looked so funny that the lantern man laughed. Till the tears ran down his shining face, and if the Piskey had had his laugh, he would have laughed too. On and on the lantern rushed, zigzagging up and down and up, and as it went strange moss and queer things that go about only by night fluttered their wings against the bright windows and doors. Once a witty mouse with a face like a cat looked in and then vanished into the darkness, and once a short-eared owl gripped the lantern by its talons, but sped on all the same. After about an hour after midnight, the lantern reached Dawsmere Pool, which lies on the top of a great lonely moor surrounded by desolate hills. The moon was only a few days old and had set long before the sun had gone down, but it was by no means dark by the big pool, for there was starshine from innumerable stars, and also the light that fell from the wonderful little lantern. And the little lantern man stopped his lantern on a boulder by the pool, where was stretched a huge, dark form almost as big as a headland. It was giant Tregeagle, lying face down on the margin of the pool, dipping water with a limpet shell that had a hole in it. The little lantern man opened the door of his lantern, and telling the little Piskey that now was his chance to ask the giant about his laugh, he helped him out. "Shout into his ear till he hears you," he whispered, hanging out of his door. "And don't despair if he does not hear you just at first." The Piskey stepped up quite close to the great giant, and he looked so tiny beside him that the little lantern man laughed and said he was like a God's little cow by the side of a plow horse. "Why," he said, "his ear alone would make a dozen little chaps like you and me. Now I must be off and give light to the poor things that want light. Good luck to you, my friend, in finding your laugh." And the little lantern man closed the door of his lantern, which sped away over the big pool, shedding light as it went. The Piskey watched the lantern till it was hidden among the reeds and rushes, and then he turned his face to the giant's ear, and when he climbed up into it, he shouted, "Giant Tregeagle! Giant Tregeagle! I am a poor little Piskey who's lost his laugh. Please stop dipping water for a minute and tell me if you've seen it." But the giant took no notice of the little Piskey, and went on dipping water with a limpet shell that had a hole in it. Again and again the tiny brown Piskey shouted into the giant's ear, but the big giant took no more notice of this little piping voice than if a fly had buzzed close to his ear, and he went on dipping. Once more the Piskey shouted with all the voice he had, thrusting his red-capped head into the hollow of the giant's ear as he shouted, "Giant Tregeagle! Giant Tregeagle! I am a poor little Piskey who has lost his laugh. Please stop dipping water for a minute and tell me if you've seen it." This time the giant heard, and without pausing for a moment his hopeless task of emptying the pool dry, he said, "What tiny squeak did I hear?" The Piskey was too frightened to answer, for Giant Tregeagle's voice was almost as loud as the roar of the breakers breaking in the cavern under King Arthur's castle, and the tiny little fallow crouched down in the curl of the giant's ears. "What tiny squeak did I hear?" again asked the giant, and the little Piskey, taking his courage in both his hands, answered back as loud as he could, "It was little Piskey who spoke to you. A little Piskey has had the great misfortune to lose his laugh. A little Piskey has lost his laugh, has he? Roared Giant Tregeagle. Why, that's nothing compared to a giant who has lost his soul. Have you lost your soul? Cried the little Piskey, who, having got the giant's ear, could now make his tiny voice distinctly heard. Yes, I've lost my soul, moaned the great fellow. His moan shivered over the surface of Dawsmere Pool, and made all the sallows that grew beside it shiver and shake as if a blasting wind had passed over them. And the reeds and rushes growing in the water sighed so sadly that the little Piskey felt ever so wished, and sighed too. How did you come to lose your soul, Mr. Giant? Asked the little Piskey after a while. That's a question, answered the giant, beginning again his hopeless task of emptying the pool. Have you never looked for your soul? Queried the tiny fellow, who, having lost his laugh, felt very sorry for the unhappy giant who'd lost so precious a thing as his soul. It was no good to look for my soul when I gave it away in exchange for wealth, cried the giant. I can never get it back unless I empty this big pool of every drop of water that it has in it. And can't you do that, and you a giant? Asked the little Piskey in surprise. I'm afraid I can't with a limpet shell that has a hole in it, and I am not allowed to use any other. Will you let me help you to empty the pool? Asked the tiny Piskey. I'm only a little bit of a chap compared to you, I know, and God's little cow by the side of a plough horse, the man in the lantern said, as the giant laughed sardonically. And my dinky hand is nothing for size, but it hasn't a hole in it. You can help me if you like, said the giant with another sardonic laugh. It will be perhaps another case of a mouse freeing a lion. Who knows, cried Piskey, who took the giant's remark quite seriously, and climbing out of the huge air, he slid down over the boulder to the pool, and making a dipper of his tiny hands, began to dip water out as fast as he could, and never stopped dipping once till a movement behind him made him pause, and looking up he saw the great big giant on his feet towering above him like a tor, with an awful look of rage on his face. I can never empty Dawsmere Pool with a limpet shell that has a hole in it, howled the giant. No, not if I dip till the day of doom. And he flung the shell into the big pool. As he flung it, a great blast of rage broke from him and lashed the dark water of the big pool in fury. He howled and howled, and his howls were heard in every part of the lonely waste surrounding the pool, and went roaring around the far-stretching moors, and were echoed by the desolate hills. By and by the giant turned his back on the pool, and strode away in the direction of the sea, howling and roaring as he went. The little Piskey was so terrified by the giant's roaring that he crept into a water rat's hole, and never ventured out for a night and a day. The second night, after the giant had gone, he came out of the hole to see if he had returned, but he had not. He was disappointed in spite of the fright he had received, for the giant had never told him whether he had seen his laugh, and he did not know where to go in search of it, or whom to ask if he had been seen. As he thought about this, he became very miserable, almost as miserable as the unhappy giant who had sold his soul, and he wished with all his heart that the kind little man in the lantern would come his way again. As he was wishing this, he looked over the big pool, which was very dark and unlit by a single star, when something very soft and bright smote the black water on the opposite side of the pool. Thinking it was the dear little man in the lantern come in to answer his wish, he fixed his gaze upon the brightness. And in a minute or two, a little barge shot out from the reeds and came swiftly towards him, and he saw, for the Piskeys can see in the dark like a cat, that the barge was being rowed across the big pool by a little old man. The soft light that smote the water came from the prow of the little craft and lit up the face of the bargeman, which was half turned towards the Piskey and was very seared and brown. When the barge came near the spot where the Piskey was standing, the tiny bargeman said, "Who are you? Looking as if you had the world on your back. What are you doing here this time of night, when all good folk ought to be in bed?" "I am a poor unfortunate Piskey, who has lost his laugh," answered the tiny little Piskey, and his voice was very sad. "Oh, it's a dreadful thing to lose your laugh," said the little old bargeman. "It is," responded the little Piskey. "The little man in the lantern thought so too. He brought me all the way from Rough Tor Marsh to Dawsmere Pool in his lantern to ask Giant Tregeagle if I'd seen it." If he'd seen it. "And didn't you ask Giant Tregeagle that important question after the little lantern had brought you so far?" asked the little bargeman. "I did, but he was so troubled about something he'd lost, his soul it was, that he forgot to say whether he'd seen my laugh." "That is a pity, for the giant is now on St. Minver sandhills making trusses of sand and sand ropes to bind them with. When the sand ropes break in his hand, which they are sure to do when he tries to lift them, he will fly away to Lowbar to work at another impossible task." "How do you know that?" asked the little Piskey. The tiny bargeman looked at the green-coated, red-capped little Piskey with a strange expression in his dark eyes for a second or two, and then he said, "I have lived so long in this world that I know most things. For people who knew me in a faraway time called me Merlin the Magician, and said I had all the secrets of the world in the back of my head." "Then you'll be able to tell me where my laugh has gone to?" struck in the little Piskey eagerly. "I was speaking more of the past than of the present," said the tiny bargeman. "Since the time of which I spoke, I have lived here by this lake, now called Dawsmere Pool. I lived sealed up in a stone into which the Lady of the Lake shut me till 100 years ago or so." "How very unkind of the lady to put you into a stone," said the little Piskey indignantly. "Whatever did she do it for?" "Thereby hangs a tale which is not good for a small Piskey like you to hear," returned the tiny bargeman, with another strange look in his dark, mysterious little eyes. "When Nemu, the Lady of the Lake, shut me up in stone, like a toad in a hole, she said, she thought she'd done for me, and that I should soon die. But Merlin, the man who worked magic, was not so easily got rid of." "And you didn't die?" asked the Piskey innocently. "You must have lost your wits as well as your laugh to ask such a stupid question," said the tiny bargeman. "I did not die, or I should not be sitting in this barge now. But I grew down to the tiny old fellow you see me through, working my way out of that dreadful stone. My magical powers have also dwindled, I fear, for they are as nothing to what they once were. Therefore I am no longer Merlin the Magician, I am Merlin the Bargeman of Dawsmere Pool." "And you can't tell me where my laugh is?" asked the little Piskey wistfully. "I am a miserable, poor thing without my laugh." "I'm sure you are," said the tiny bargeman, "and I'll do what I can to help you find it. I wasn't shut up in a stone all those centuries for nothing, as perhaps you have not lost your laugh for nothing. I'll tell you at once that your laugh has never been near this desolate spot, but it is possible that Giant Tregeagle may have seen it on his wild flight down to St. Minver Sandhills. Or maybe he's seen it on the Golden Dunes. I'd advise you to go there and ask him. How can I get to the Sandhills? Asked the poor little Piskey. It would take me such a long time to get there with no dance in my feet. And there is no little lantern man here to give me a lift in his lantern. You need not trouble your head how you are to get to the Sandhills. I'll take you near there in my barge. In your barge? Echoed the little Piskey, looking over his shoulder at the long stretch of country between him and the sea, and then at the great pool set like a cup at the top of the moors with no visible outlet. Oh, you are wondering how I can take you to the great outer sea, said the tiny bargeman. For your satisfaction, I will tell you that there is an underground waterway that leads to Trebetherick Bay, close to St. Minver Sandhills. I'll take you there in my barge. Why are you so kind? Asked the little Piskey, looking gratefully at the old bargeman. My brothers were not nearly so kind. Well, I saw you helping the wicked giant dip this great mere dry, and I thought, so kind a deed deserved another, answered the little bargeman lightly. And I told myself as I watched you I would do you a kindness if you needed a kindness. Will you let me take you to Trebetherick Bay? Gladly, answered the little Piskey. Get into my barge, then, cried the old bargeman, and the Piskey scrambled in and sat in the stern of the barge facing the bargeman. I like rowing about this pool, remarked the tiny bargeman as he put his little craft about and began to row from the shore. It has so many memories. It was here by this mere that the Lady of the Lake, not the one who shut me in stone, forged the wonderful Excalibur, the two-handled sword with the jeweled hilt, which she gave to Arthur the King, who, you know, afterwards ruled all the land. It was here that Sir Bedivere, one of the knights of the far-famed Round Table, flung the sword by the order of the wounded king, and was caught by the lake lady's uplifted arm. It was here, but you are not listening, he cried, breaking off his sentence as he noticed that the little Piskey was not paying any attention to what he was saying. I'm afraid I wasn't, he said, very much ashamed. I'm very dull and stupid since I lost my laugh. Well, you can't be more stupid than I was when I was shut up in the stone, said the tiny old bargeman. And I can well excuse your stupidity. He said nothing more, for just then the barge reached the shore from which it had put off, and without getting out, he reached over and touched a big stone with an oar. He had no sooner touched the stone than it sprang back and revealed a dark, deep tunnel into which the little barge shot like a thing alive. This underground waterway was known to the fair ladies who lived by the pool, and who took away the wounded king in their little ship to the Vale of Avilion, he remarked the bargeman when the stone shut up itself behind him. Did they? Asked the little Piskey, trying to look interested. Yes, he answered, and they also knew of another waterway, which will never be revealed to anybody except by the good king, he added half to himself, looking straight before him into the darkness of the narrow passage as he steered. The tiny barge, which was a very ancient-looking little craft, with a gilded dragon forming its prow, sped on, but for its size it might well have been the same little ship to which Merlin, the little old bargeman, had just referred, The waterway was very long and deep, and the water ran so swiftly that the barge did not now require to be rowed. It was also very dark, and the only light that shone was a little light on the boat. The little old bargeman did not speak again till a roaring fell on their ears. "It is the noise of water breaking at Padstow Doombar," he said, as the little Piskey looked frightened. "I thought it was the great giant Tregeagle howling," gasped the little Piskey. "He hasn't tried to lift his sand ropes yet, and he won't begin his howl of rage till he finds out how brittle they are," said the little bargeman. "And a very good thing for you," he added, "for he'll be far too angry to tell you whether he's seen your laugh when the ropes of sand break in his great hand. There! We are close now to the great outer sea," he cried, as the thunder of waves broke more loudly on their ears, and they saw the light of many stars through a narrow opening. And the next minute the little barge came into Trebetherick Bay. "You only have to go up across the hillocks," said the little old bargeman, helping little Piskey out of the barge. "And if you follow your nose, you'll soon get to where the giant is busy making sand ropes." "Thank you for bringing me here," said the little Piskey, but he never knew whether he was heard or not, for the tiny bargeman and his ancient barge vanished as he spoke. GS says, "Well, this lantern sounds like a riot." Yeah, it reminded me of that scene in, I think it's the third Harry Potter. They have a bus that goes like that. The Piskey made haste to follow his nose, and he scrambled up a sandbank and hastened as fast as his feet could take him over the sandy common, till he came to the place where the giant Tregeagle was sitting making sand ropes to bind his trusses of sand which lay all around him. He was sitting by a hillock, his great head showing just above it, when the Piskey came near. The little Piskey climbed nearly to the top of the hillock, and when he got close to the giant's ear, he shouted, "I am the little Piskey who told you he had lost his laugh. Please stop making sand ropes for a minute and tell me if you have seen it." But the big giant took no notice of the tiny voice and went on making his ropes of sand. The little Piskey then got into his ear and poked his red-capped head into the hollow of it and again shouted, "I am the little Piskey who told you he lost his laugh. And, the dinky little fellow who tried to help me find my soul," interrupted the great giant in a voice almost as loud as the waves breaking on the Padstow Doombar. "Yes, and a dinky little bargeman brought me from Dawsmere Pool to Trebetherick that you might answer my question." "I know who you mean. Merlin, the little old master of magic," cried the giant in evident astonishment, pausing in his work of making a rope of sand to stare at the little Piskey. "Fancy his bringing a tiny brown fellow like you from Dawsmere Pool to Trebetherick Bay in his magic barge. The pigs will fly and sing after this." He saw me helping you dip the pool dry, and said that one kind deed deserved another," said the Piskey, as meek as a harvest mouse. "So he brought me all the way down to St. Minver to know if you had seen my laugh. Have you seen it, Mr. Giant?" "No, I have not seen it," answered the giant. "Nothing so cheerful as a Piskey's laugh would come near such a mountain of misery as I am. And if by an evil chance it did come, it would flee far from my dark shadow." "Do you know anyone else who has seen my laugh?" asked the little Piskey piteously. "Not one." "Bless your cousins, the night riders have," answered the giant, looking at the sand ropes he'd just finished lying at his feet. "I must now begin to bind my trusses of sand." He stooped to lift them as he spoke, and as he tried to take them up, they fell to pieces in his hands. As they crumbled away, his face was awful to see, and he began to howl and roar, and cries of rage rang out over the sand hills and over Trebetherick Bay, and were heard above the noise of the waves breaking on Padstow Doombar. Those roars of rage and anger so frightened the people living in the villages in the neighborhood of the common that they shook in their beds. And as for the little Piskey, he was so terrified by what he had heard that he tumbled over the hillock up which he climbed to get into the giant's ear. When he picked himself up, the giant Tregeagle was flying away like an evil bird towards the south. The dawn broke soon after the giant had gone, and as Piskies always hide by day, he hid himself under a clump of tamarisk and stayed there till the dark and the stars came again. When he came out, he remembered what the giant had said, that perhaps his cousins, the night riders, had seen his laugh, the moon being several days older than when the kind little lantern man had taken him to Dawsmere Pool. It was now shining brightly over the common, and he knew that if the night riders were in the neighborhood of the sandhills, they would soon be riding over the common. Making sand ropes, so many futile activities in this story, says GS. Yeah, well, the giant is trying to save his soul after he lost it. And I think there's sort of a metaphor there that you can't. And this beautiful drawing, which I know is unfortunately tiny on the stream, is of a horse, but its mane and its back and its tail are being clung to by little people, which are the night riders that the giant talked about. That are relatives of the Piskies. So, I mean, it's hard to see, but you can kind of make out there that there is a people, sort of little people hanging on to it, driving the horse mad, I suppose. As he was gazing about the wistful eyes, a young colt came galloping along with scores of little night riders astride his back, and as many more hanging on to his mane and tail. The night riders, who were little people no bigger than Piskies and quite as mischievous, had taken the colt from a farmer's stable close to the common, and were enjoying their stolen ride as only night riders could. As they and the colt drew near, the little Piskey stood out in the moonshine and shouted, "Night riders! Night riders, please stop! I want to ask you something!" But the little night riders were enjoying their gallop too much to listen or stop, and they flew by like the wind. The colt was fresh and galloped like mad, and soon went round the common and back again. And as he was galloping by, the Piskey once more shouted to the little night riders to stop, but they took no heed, and once more flew by like the wind. Ever so many times the colt galloped round the sandy common, leaping over the hillocks in his mad gallop, and each time he passed, the little Piskey stood out in the moonshine and called out. But the night riders took not the slightest notice, nor pulled up the colt to see what he wanted. At last, when the Piskey had given up all hope of the night riders stopping, the colt, who was quite worn out with galloping so hard round and round the broken common, put his foot into a rabbit hole and came down with a crash, with his many little riders on top of him. One little night rider, who happened to be astride the colt's left ear, was pitched off at the Piskey's feet. He looked as bright as a robin in his riding coat, brown leggings, and his bright green cap with a wren's feather stuck in its front. When he had picked himself up, he thrust his tiny brown hands into his breeches pockets, stared hard at the little Piskey, and cried, "What wushed little beggar are you?" "I am a poor little chap who's lost his laugh," answered the Piskey. "I shouted every time you galloped the colt past here to ask if you'd seen it, but you never stopped." "Of course we did not stop galloping because a Piskey called," said the little night rider. How came you to be such a gawk as to lose your laugh? I have no idea, the Piskey returned. I only know it went away all of a sudden, and I've been searching for it ever since. Have you seen my little lost laugh? No, but Grandfer Night Rider might have, answered the little Night Rider. He has wonderful eyes for seeing things that are lost. Is Grandfer Night Rider here? Asked the Piskey, sending his glance in the direction of the colt, who was almost smothered with Night Riders, some standing on his side as he lay, and others still in the stirrups they made in his tail and mane. He was on top of the colt's tail a minute ago, answered the little Night Rider, following the Piskey's glance. There he is, pointing to a tiny old fellow with a bushy gray beard coming towards them, carrying a tamarisk switch in his hand, with which he lashed the air as he came. He wore a long red riding coat, green breeches, red cap, and feather like the other little Night Riders. What woe-begone little rascal are you? Asked the old greybeard, staring hard at the Piskey. A Piskey who has lost his laugh, answered the little Night Rider for him, and had the impertinence to stop one... Oh, sorry. Wrong person. A Piskey who lost his laugh, answered the little Night Rider for him, and had the impertinence to want us to stop galloping to tell him if he'd seen it. You were very foolish to lose your laugh, said Grandfer Night Rider, standing in front of the unhappy little Piskey. How'd you manage to lose it? And the poor little fellow, without lifting his eyes from the sandy ground, told him. You are in queer lane, my son, said Grandfer Night Rider when he had told him how he'd lost his laugh. I'd not give a grain of corn for you. Wouldn't you? Wailed the poor little Piskey. No, I wouldn't, nor half a grain either. Quite a crowd of scarlet-coated little Night Riders had gathered near the Piskey by this time, and had listened to all that was said, and one little Night Rider asked if a Piskey had ever had the misfortune to lose his laugh before. Yes, sir, once long ago, answered the old greybeard, fixing his eye on the little Piskey, who trembled beneath his gaze. And what was worse still, he never found it again. And so very unhappy was that little fellow without his laugh, and so miserable did he make everybody with his bewailings, that at last the Piskey tribe, to which he belonged, sent out a command that whoever found him wandering about the country was to take him in charge as a Piskey vagrant, put him in a Piskey bag, and hang him upside down like a witty mouse in the first cavern they came to. He was found, put into a Piskey bag, and hung up in a cavern. There he still is, and there he will hang till there are no more small people. Has the order yet been given for this little Piskey vagrant to be taken up and treated in like manner? Another asked another little Night Rider. The poor little Piskey did not wait to hear the answer, but took to his heels and ran as fast as he could to the north, and the little Night Riders who were still standing on the colt watched him till he was out of sight. And Grandfer Night Rider and all the other little Night Riders yelled after him to stop, but he did not stop. Piskey ran, and he never stopped running till he came to Castle Gardens, whence he had started. When he got there, he was as exhausted as a colt ridden all night by naughty Night Riders, and he sank down all of a heap by the side of a molehill where two tiny hands were again sticking up. Is your ladyship under the hill? Asked the little Piskey when he could speak. Yes, answered the mole. Who are you? The little Piskey who lost his laugh. What? Haven't you found it yet? No, he answered sadly. I am dreadfully afraid I never shall. If I don't find it soon, I shall be taken up for a Piskey vagrant, put in a bag and hung upside down like a witty mouse in some cavern. Well, that'll be a very tragic end to a bright little Piskey, said the mole. Tell me, how do you know that that will be your fate if you don't find your laugh? And the Piskey told her, In fact, the Lady Want was so interested about what the Grandfer Knight Rider had said that she begged him to tell her all his adventures from the time he set out to Rough Tor Marsh in search of his laugh till his return to Castle Gardens, which he was quite glad to do so. "Well, you ought to have found your laugh after all your travels and what you've gone through," said the Lady Want when he had related everything. "And I hope you will. Does your ladyship happen to know anybody else who may have seen my laugh?" asked the little Piskey wistfully. "Only one." "And who might that one be?" queried the little Piskey. "Will your ladyship be kind enough to tell me?" "The good King Arthur," the mole answered in a low voice. "Good King Arthur?" ejaculated the Piskey. "Why, he's dead, and a dead king is no more good than a Piskey without his laugh." "King Arthur is not dead," said the mole. "Not dead?" echoed the little Piskey in great surprise. "No. He was seen perched only last evening on his own seat, which is still called King Arthur's Seat, and which, as I dare say you know, overhangs the sea," which, by the way, is a real place in Cornwall. You can look it up, called King Arthur's Seat. "King Arthur the King is not dead," whispered the little Piskey, as if he could not get over his amazement. "A precious good thing for you he isn't," snapped the mole. "But how isn't he dead?" asked the little Piskey. "Because he was changed by magic into a bird," answered the mole. "He haunts the Dundergell cliffs and the ruins of his old castle in the form of a chew, which is kind of a blackbird. He was wounded almost unto death in his last great battle, it is true," she added, for the small man looked as if he wanted this strange happening fully explained. "And the marks of his battle he fought and the hurts he received are yet upon him. And as the legs and beaks of the great blackbird plainly show, as plainly as my own tiny hands, that I was once a great lady, but he is still alive. If you should see a bird with a red beak and legs flying over King Arthur's castle as day is beginning to break, you may be quite certain that he is King Arthur. If he has seen your laugh, he will be sure to tell you. He is very kind and good, as all the world knows." And there's a picture of it. A real picture, not a drawing, of King Arthur's Seat in Cornwall. A very cool place, but it would take some courage to sit there. "I am glad the good king is not dead," said the little Piskey. "I'll try and keep awake till the dawn so that I can ask him about my laugh, but I am so tired." The little fellow did his best to keep awake, but he was too worn out with his run from St. Minver Sandhills to Tintagel Castle to sit and watch for the coming of the red-legged bird, and long before the sun wheeled up behind the tors and shone upon the sea, he was sound asleep under a great mallow growing by one of the great old walls. And when he awoke, a day and a night had come and gone, and the birth of a new day was at hand. When he crawled out from under the mallow, the first thing he saw on the island facing him was the dark form of a great black Jew. He was perched on the wall above the old arched doorway, gazing gravely in front of him. The Piskey lost not a moment in getting across to the island, which he did by the Piskey Passage, known only to the Piskeys. And when he had caught the bird's attention, he said, "I am a poor little Piskey who's lost his laugh. I am come to ask the good King Arthur if he's seen it." But the bird was too high up for him to make himself heard, and he had to wait patiently till it flew down, and after waiting a short time it did, and perched on a stick stuck in the ground. The Piskey ran over, and clasping his hands, he repeated what he had just said. "How came you to know I was King Arthur?" asked the Chew, ignoring the fellow's little question. "The mole, who says she is the Lady Want, told me," he answered. "Ah, I know her. The grand lady who considered the ground on which she walked was not good enough for her dainty feet, and has now, as a punishment, to walk under the ground, a lesson to all the children of pride. But please, good King Arthur, answer my question about my laugh, he pleaded the little Piskey in an agony of impatience. If I don't find it soon, something dreadful will happen to me. Have patience, said the Chew kindly. Nothing is ever won by impatience. I have seen something very funny lately running around about over the grass. It is likely nothing I have ever seen before except in a Piskey's face when he laughs. It is like a laugh gone mad. It is enough to kill a man with laughing, only to watch its antics. It made me laugh till I ached when I first noticed it. It does not make a sound, but its grimaces are worth flying 100 miles only to see. It must have been my laugh you saw, cried the Piskey. My dear little lost laugh that I've travelled so far to find. Where is it now, good King Arthur? It was here not long since, answered the bird, who did not deny that he was Arthur the King. Why, there it is, quite close to you, pointing his long pointed beak towards the most comical looking thing you ever saw, on the grass a foot from where the Piskey was standing. It was a laugh gone mad, as the Chew said. The Piskey looked behind him, and when he saw the little bit of laughing, grinning absurdity on the grass, he jumped for joy and shrieked, It is my own little laugh that I lost! Holding out both his arms, he cried, Oh, dear little laugh, come back to me! Oh, dear little laugh, come back to me! And the droll little thing, which was a grin with a laugh, and a laugh with a grin, came over to the Piskey and began to climb up his legs, grinning and doubling itself up with laughter as it climbed, till it reached his chin, where it narrowed itself into a tiny grin, and vanished into the Piskey. The next moment, the Piskey was shouting at the top of his voice, I have got my laugh! I have got my laugh! And he ran off laughing and dancing to the edge of the cliff and disappeared into the Piskey hole. In a few minutes more, he was on the castle gardens in the great Piskey ring, laughing and dancing and dancing and laughing. His laugh was so loud and so free that his brother Piskeys heard him from afar and came running over the cliffs from Bossiny to see whatever had happened. Little Fiddler Piskey was the first to reach the garden, and the first glance at the little whirling figure told him that his little brother had found his laugh. And putting his fiddle in position, he began fiddling away as hard as he could. As he fiddled, the other Piskeys, including Grandfer Piskey, reached the ring, and the next minute they were all dancing and laughing as they had never laughed and danced before. But the one who laughed the heartiest was the little Piskey who had lost and found his laugh. They danced for a good hour, the little fiddler in their midst fiddling his fiddle, all the while keeping time with his head and foot, heedless that the daylight was driving the darkness away to the country to which it belongs. And King Arthur the bird flew up on the wall and watched, and the mole who called herself the Lady Want let her dainty hands be seen on the molehill, till the fiddling, dancing, and laughing were finished, and the Piskeys went off to the Piskey beds to sleep. And that is how the Piskey found their laugh. GS says, oh, that Knight Rider's clinging to the horse is an amazing illustration. It really is. It's deceptively complex. She also said these Knight Riders are little devils. Yeah, they're more like in the Yeats book on Irish elves and such. They're more like that. Nasty little things. Such a specific punishment. Yeah, I always wonder, these really specific punishments they have in these stories, whether they are just about just mean things or whether they actually have some sort of historical relevance. I wouldn't even know where to begin to figure that out, though. Not that I haven't thought of it and tried. GS says, such an enchanting story. Yeah, I will admit, it goes on for much longer than you would feel a simple story about a laugh would go. And I certainly, when I originally read it, did not expect how much it roped King Arthur in. But it's interesting because it's basically a view of an area of England as still sort of having these strands of its history, its mythical history in it. I think the point of the story, which is never explicitly stated, is basically that trying that something that's always happy will have, without hardship, will necessarily be kind of self-centered and assume everything else is happy and doesn't need help. And I think basically in its experience of strife, losing its laughter, losing its joy, and being forced to go and speak to people in its time of need, taught it, what selfishness was. It's not clear how much it grew from that, but I do feel like that's kind of the message of it. I don't know why the bird is King Arthur, but it's a neat thought that there are birds in Cornwall that are King Arthur. Well, anyhow, that very complex story, which took us pretty much a solid almost 90 minutes to read, which is, I knew it was long, I didn't think it was that long, brings us to the end. Shut up, Windows. Thanks for ruining our magic. The Windows sound of the Piskies. His joy was greater after, GS says. That's true, actually, yeah. By the way, if anyone has ever said to you, oh, that's the hero's story, or the hero's tale, or the hero's journey is probably the most common way it's said, and you're not too sure what that's referencing, it's referencing a mode of storytelling that's very popular. It comes up in lots of places. It tracks its way all the way back to like the Homeric Odysseys of Greece and so on. However, that was a hero's journey. It's not the most, it doesn't have all the features of it, but the hero's journey is defined by a hero leaves a place, its home or something like that. They go out on this journey and they grow through a series of meeting people and strife and challenges and so on, but they eventually circle back to where they came from, and using what has changed over that journey, they use it to sort of bring something to their home or fix their home or whatever else. So it's a classic hero's journey model. It's obviously not as dramatic as they usually are, but it's there. Anyways, it was a quiet night around the fire for all of us. And I appreciate those of you who have come by to watch. And if you're watching this as a recording later, what we call video on demand, I appreciate your watching as well. And I hope you enjoyed it. Sorry if it went a little long, if that wasn't what you were looking for. But I greatly appreciate everyone who comes to my cabin to listen to some stories. I'm going to carry on, and you carry on too.